So this is Using Your Brain, Part 2, and the biggest mistake you make using your brain and how it shows up in your life. So in this video, I'm going to talk about how this sort of lack of using our brain correctly shows up in the most obvious way, and of course astrologically as well. This is part of the Mercury, Exalted, and using our discrimination properly sort of framework. Now, one of the things to understand, in the previous video I talked about how we get into this sort of I get it already, we gather some information or some data, and then it becomes some information, and then we think we understand it, we think it's knowledge before it is knowledge, and then we think that it's, so much, knowledge that it's actually wisdom, and now we're ready to kind of tell everybody else how it all works. This is sort of the delusion. But what happens is we don't really understand it yet, and instead we start grasping for other things that are more and more complicated because we're getting further and further away from the truth, which is that we haven't really applied any of it yet, and it's very ungrounded. And so, there's this evolution of data, which becomes information, which becomes knowledge, and eventually becomes wisdom. This is the four steps that I've identified as how data, which is the lowest form of details, becomes actual wisdom, which is something that we understand, we comprehend, we test, and then we have seen it over time. So, what happens is instead of being really, grounded in this, we're generally mostly emotional creatures. We do what we feel like doing, and then we justify it in reverse with a bunch of explanations that don't really make sense. This is why I say we're not really using our discrimination a whole lot. We're actually doing what we feel like doing, and then reverse engineering that feeling with a bunch of explanations. Well, it's because of this, and we bring some explanation that seems to be plausible to our mind, but it's actually not. That's not the reason we're doing something, or following something, or listening to something, or we're actually doing it because there's some feeling that we have about the person telling us, or some other bias that we're confirming, a thing called confirmation bias. So this is how we generally make decisions, and then we kind of reverse engineer some detail. Oh, well, it's because of this or that. Again, this is very rampant in this information age, where instead of actually learning things correctly and listening to authorities, and I mean authorities, like people who have done the work for decades, instead we listen to the person that we like to listen to, or that's more attractive. We're seduced by appearances. We're seduced by what's also called things like social proof. Well, if this person has more Facebook likes, then they must be better, I'll listen to them. And then we see them and they're charming or whatnot. None of this has any bearing on whether or not what they're saying is true or correct. Again, we're very biased and we're emotional creatures. We base most of our decisions on our emotions. This is why I even said at the beginning, at the last video, that we don't use our brain in the sense of discrimination, like actually saying, is this correct or not? Is this true or not? We get some feeling and we go with that, and we like the person who's telling us, so we listen to what they're saying, and then we go back and it kind of lowers our guard so that pretty much anything they say we're going to sort of believe and not really get the details straight. Now again, this is how the quality of Mercury starts to degrade, and how we stop being thorough and stop using our discrimination. Again, it's a very kind of Piscean thing where it all kind of blurs together, and oh yeah, I like them, and it becomes quite emotional, whereas in Virgo is like, but that's not very sensible, that's not very practical, that's not a very good, precise, accurate way of making decisions. You can tell how well you understand something by how well you can explain it. Absolutely, you must be able to explain something. If you're asking, well, what about the next thing in anything in your life? You can even use like politics or whatever it is. If you can't really explain the thing very well, then you don't understand it very well. They're both connected to Mercury. I get this all the time with myself. Oh, well, Sam, I really understand it. I just can't explain it as well as you can because you're a Gemini or whatever it is. No. The things that you understand really well, you can explain them really well. Relative to your level of proficiency, which everyone has a certain proficiency in something that they understand really well. And the things that you explain really well and that you've learned really well are things you have experienced. Again, things you have lived through. You can explain exactly what it was like to have the job that you have and what it's like there because you live it. Again, you want to understand as it relates to things, let's say like astrology or something like this, where you might have this illusion of knowledge. To someone like myself, it is my experience. I lived through that. I lived through all of these readings. I see this happening in real time, just like you see happen in your job. You know exactly what it's like to do your job, exactly what it's like to live through that experience. And what you say about it, you can explain. You can explain exactly what it's like to be a programmer in an office as a team of programmers where you start here and then you gradually ascend and now you're the supervisor of the programmers and now you have a boss above you. I don't have no idea what that's like. I could guess and I could have a bunch of ideas about it. But if that's your lived experience, the ideas that I would have about it would be very different than your experience of having done it. But imagine, let's say if that's your experience in your work, and I had all these ideas. Oh, no, it's like this. Well, you say it's like that through your lived experience, but I think it's this. And I started just having a whole bunch of ideas about my belief about what it would be like to do that. You'd be sitting there like, dude, you have no idea what you're talking about. I know what this is about. I live it. That's how it sounds to me when people say these things about astrology, for example. But again, I'm not just talking about myself, but think about this difference between information that you've gathered and data that you might have about the thing, and then the practice of that thing and the wisdom that comes after practicing and doing it and living it. Okay? So these are some, big things to understand. Now, again, I said that one of the main things I'm going to talk about in this video is the number one way that it shows up in your life, certainly with astrology. And that is something that I just said earlier in the video, and that has to do with this thing called judgment and belief. What happens is what you can recognize that you're not really using your brain very well. First of all, if you can't explain what you think is correct very well, if you can't explain it, then you don't understand it. Instead, what you have is a belief about it. You have a belief about it. And this is what many people have with astrology. I usually can win any argument with a skeptic very quickly because, first of all, I'm not taking on their arguments because they don't understand what they're talking about. They have beliefs about astrology, but because they don't practice astrology, they have just a bunch of beliefs about it. And so when I talk to skeptics about this is what I tell them. I tell them, look, you don't know what you're talking about. You just have a bunch of beliefs about astrology. Crazy enough, you're saying that I believe in it. I don't believe in astrology. I practice it. I do it because it works, and I see it work, and it's a practice for me, not a belief. And I tell the skeptic, it's a belief for you because you don't know what you're talking about. And this is what beliefs are. Beliefs are things that we must take a leap of faith into because we don't actually know it or understand it. We don't know for sure, so we have to have a belief. There's nothing wrong with beliefs. In fact, beliefs serve a very useful function, especially after we've started to learn something and we know there's a lot more, but we haven't gotten there yet. For example, something like God. We must have a belief about God because we're not merged with God yet. But think of something like the sun or your hand. Do you believe in your hand? Well, no, you don't believe in your hand. Your hand is not a belief. It's a real thing that you use and you know it's real. Just like astrology and astrological methods and techniques, to someone like myself, or like people who have studied with me a long time or whatnot, it's real for them. It's a practice. It's not a belief. They know what they're doing. There's as much certainty in that as it is you and your hand. There's no belief about it. It's real. And they can explain it. They can explain why it works, how it works, and it's accurate what they say. All those details line up. But here's the thing. This number one mistake, where things become beliefs, not facts or not truth, also turns into judgments. And this is, again, one of the biggest problems that astrology students and astrologers, frankly, have, is rather than interpret things and explain them correctly and interpret every one of these little details, in fact, they turn into judgments. And every confusion that every astrologer or astrology student has, every time they're confused, it's because of one thing. It's because they're colliding with their judgments. Their judgments are on a collision course. Because no two things in astrology are ever the same. I don't care how much it looks like the same thing. It's not. Or I don't care how much it looks like they're in conflict with each other. Nothing is ever contradicting each other. That's what I meant to say. Nothing is ever in conflict or contradicting each other. Because everything is different than everything else. The only time things appear to contradict each other is when your judgments are in conflict. Well, there's a good thing and a bad thing, a good thing and a bad thing, so which one is it, good or bad? That's the only mistake. It's the only problem. And by the way, not just with astrology, but in life, is we don't use our brain. We don't think correctly because it takes too much work. We think in black and white beliefs. Who's right? Who's wrong? Is it good? Is it bad? Good, bad, right, wrong. I say this all the time. But this is the death of discrimination. Notice Mercury in the planetary order, he's in between Mars and Jupiter. Mars on one side, which is saying, is it right or wrong, good or bad, because I need to know what to do. That's what right, wrong, good, bad thinking is good for. To make us do something. We need to do what we know is right, which is Mars. We know it's right. We know it's right to get up early, eat the right amount of food, do our spiritual practices. We know that's right. We just don't do it. Doing what we know is right is this sort of province of Mars. We don't do what's right. Instead, what's right then becomes some idea in Mercury, which can turn into some opinion that we then spout and talk about, rather than actually using our discrimination. Mercury is not meant to be the mouthpiece of Mars to lecture people about what we know is right. I say that with irony in this video, because that's all I'm doing. But I'm trying to do it with discrimination. No, but it's meant to take those judgments of or those opinions of Mars and then look for how to apply them. Because again, once these actions of right and wrong Mars, again, Mars is about actions. If you're doing the actions that are right, then it's not colliding with Mercury, which is how right and wrong filters down into all of its multiple possible forms. Because Mercury is about understanding how all of this came to be. And it's through all these little details, all these little situations, all these little moments. All these details then need to be connected to that higher purpose, which is Jupiter. Once they're connected to something higher, then Mercury is speaking these deep truths, and they come from a place of wisdom. But that wisdom, again, because Jupiter comes after, we need to be very careful that we're not collapsing all of those details into some judgment, because Jupiter is also the judgment that comes after the details. The reason you get stuck, if you don't learn all these details correctly, which is Mercury, then you're going to lapse into this, but which one is it, good or bad, right or wrong? I just can't keep all the details straight. Give me a judgment, make it a judgment. Well, it's debilitated, that's bad, it's bad. All right, well, what does that mean? But it's also joined its ruler, so that's not so bad. And it's in an angle, then that's good, but it's also aspected by Saturn, that's not so good. And by the way, this is the stuff astrologers say to some extent. Again, the really good ones don't, because they learn how to explain all these things, but all of that needs to be explained. Good and bad are judgments that are irrelevant. Nobody wants to hear it's just good. They want to hear it brought to life. And again, because that's hard and it takes more work, we collapse this precision this interpretive precision into some judgment. Make it easier for me. Come on, is it good or bad? And this is one of the things that students sometimes when they start studying with me, it drives them crazy. It doesn't drive me crazy because I just come back and show it. But they're so used to learning this. And again, if you're trying to learn astrology, I understand that it's so deeply embedded in everything you think. It's almost like, that's why I said it's the number one problem by far. It's the only source of confusion. And it's the main source of delusion. You think you understand something because you've gathered some data and you got some information about what are the good things, what are the bad things. This is a good thing, this is a bad thing. If I see this, it's bad. If I see this, it's good. But I have this, it's good. But I have that's bad. And it's just this thing between good and bad. You can't explain any of it most of the time. Most people can't explain almost anything that they know already, that they've already interpreted. This knowledge that you think you have, examine it. Can you really explain it? If you can't, you don't understand it, it's just a judgment in your mind. It's a judgment. You found something to identify. Because you can't explain it very well, it becomes a judgment. By the way, the better you are able to explain things, the less judgment you have. And everything becomes a variation on a theme, a gradation between good and bad. Nothing is really that good and nothing is really that bad. Even the greatest thing in the world can be really bad at times and the worst thing can be really good. Again, this is just common sense that we know about life, isn't it? And then people start doing astrology and they act like they don't know anything about life because of this problem. Again, notice this as well. Notice how, and I get this kind of fantasy from people with astrology. They want to get a reading and they expect that I'm going to tell them something that's so supernatural, that has no resemblance to the world, to the life they've lived. Like, oh, I thought you were going to tell me it's good, and what am I going to do to make it all good? I'm going to be, if astrology is accurate at all, it's going to be able to tell you the nuance. So people are often looking for things from astrology that bear no resemblance to life at all. We all know life is a mixture of good and bad things. But yet when we start looking at astrology, I thought it was good, and you said this thing is bad. Which one is it? Well, again, so everything is in the details. Explaining them, organizing them properly. This is why one of the biggest parts of my teaching in all contexts, certainly in my certification course, is a thing called priority and sequence. First, there's, all of the principles. You have to understand all of the principles of elements, gunas. The planets themselves are principles. Houses are principles. The zodiac itself is a principle. It's a matrix. It's a mandala of energy. All of these principles, time itself is a principle. You need to understand all of these principles, and I mean understand them. Do not get into the illusion of knowledge like you're doing right now, going, okay, time, planets, houses, signs, I understand that. I get it. Like I said in the previous video, do you really get it? Because your mind is trying to say, okay, I get it. What's next? If you can't explain it, then you don't get it. And you need to learn it correctly. And if you haven't taken a course, for example, where you've been tested and you've had to write out these answers and you've had someone say, no, this is wrong, you don't understand it, then you don't know it probably. You're just gathering stuff. It's all very Mercury and Pisces. It's all just kind of this dreamy thing that's happening. Again, Virgo says, I want to really learn this. I take it seriously, and I'm going to be tested, and I'm going to look at the results that come back. That's the tangible. This is why Mercury, again, Virgo is the archetype, but this is how Mercury data and information becomes knowledge, because now you start to know it. Now you know that this is true because you've been tested on it and you know it. Then you start to apply that knowledge over and over again, let's say to astrology charts, and then it becomes wisdom. Now it's not just something that you know, it's something that you have wisdom about, and you can teach it to others. You know what's going to happen. You can predict it. With as much certainty as I can predict that I have a hand, or that you can predict that you have a hand, I can predict absolutely what's in someone's mind by looking at their chart. Not just me, all my students that have actually gone and applied this knowledge, applied these principles, and then learn to stack those principles, which is another thing called principle stacking. Again, very Virgo-like. You stack these principles. By the way, this is how life is created. You have cells. Cells become, you have like atoms. they become molecules, they become cells, they become tissues, they become organs. Again, all these principles stack, but most of the disease doesn't come at the tissue level, it comes on the molecular level. Like a molecule something gets into a cell, which is a very basic building block of life. It's at the cellular level that things break down. Same is true with your knowledge or lack of knowledge. You don't need to pile more complexity on a structure that's not sound already, right? And so, again, that data becomes information, like you have some data points, and then it becomes information, that becomes knowledge once you start to be tested and see and really test your data, test your information and see if you know it. And the big test there is, can you explain it? That's how well you know it. And then that becomes wisdom after you apply that knowledge, let's say, to reading a lot of charts. When you don't have that, you make the one mistake, the biggest mistake that everyone makes, which is instead of having precision and understanding and using your brain correctly, organizing things in the right way, stacking principles, and then prioritizing and sequencing things, putting things in having the proper priorities, and then putting those priorities in the right sequence, that's what leads to wisdom and applying that knowledge. But when you're not doing these things, it's just some variation of good or bad, judgments flying all over the place. Moving on to the next thing. Well, I know this is good and this is bad, so what about this thing? And it's just, it just is a mess. You're not learning. And by the way, I'm not just talking about astrology. I'm using this as an example, and I'm not trying to be insulting, but, I'm being honest. And I have a lot of Mercury, and Mercury's just honest. So you can apply it to anything in your life that you're trying to learn. Anything in your life that you try to learn. The reason you do know it and the reason you do understand it is because of these things I'm talking about. It's because these things are set up properly. Because your data has become information, it's become knowledge that you have then applied, and then it becomes wisdom, and then you can do it. Not only can you do it, you can teach it. So ponder these things. I appreciate your attention, and share this video with others. And if you want to study, I have a lot of courses and whatnot as well. You can see that information here at this video. Take care.